Sometimes the smallest sound is the one that breaks a perfect life. Ava Brooks would remember later, but in that moment, standing beneath warm chandelier light and soft violin strings, she was still the bride everyone envied, wrapped in silk and certainty as laughter echoed across the private estate just outside Napa Valley, where every detail had been measured, polished, and approved by the man waiting to marry her. The gift arrived quietly, delivered by a staff member in white gloves, a velvet box no larger than a jewelry case, embossed with both their initials in gold. And when Ava lifted it, she felt the weight of something deliberate, something intimate, the kind of gesture that made guests whisper about how lucky she was, how thoughtful Graham Sinclair had always been, how rare it was to see a man so composed yet so attentive. And Ava smiled the way she had learned to smile over the past year, graceful, grateful, almost rehearsed, as she stepped away from the crowd into the bridal suite where the noise softened into a distant hum, where the mirror lights cast a glow that made everything feel like a scene already framed and ready to be remembered. She closed the door gently behind her, exhaled, and placed the box on the marble counter, her fingers hesitating just for a second before lifting the lid, and that was when she heard it, a faint, mechanical click, so small it could have been dismissed as the hinge settling into place, but it didn't belong to something handmade. It didn't belong to romance, and Ava's breath slowed as her eyes adjusted to the velvet interior, where a delicate music mechanism sat beside what looked, at first glance, like a tiny decorative stud, but the longer she stared, the more it refused to be decoration, the more it felt like it was staring back. The room suddenly felt quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, and Ava reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight, angling the beam until the reflection sharpened, and there it was, unmistakable now, a pinpoint lens hidden beneath the illusion of craftsmanship, precise, intentional, alive, and for a moment she didn't move, because movement would mean accepting what she was seeing, and accepting it would mean rewriting every memory that had led her here, every moment. Graham had known something he shouldn't have known, every time he had appeared just when she needed him, every time he had said, "I just have a feeling about you." As if intuition could explain the way he anticipated her thoughts, her calls, her silences, and suddenly those moments weren't romantic anymore. They were mapped, observed, collected. Ava straightened slowly, the soft fabric of her dress brushing against the marble. And in the mirror, she caught her own reflection, still composed, still beautiful, still exactly who everyone expected her to be. But her eyes had changed, sharpened into something quieter, colder, and far more awake. And she looked back down at the box, at the tiny hidden eye placed inside a gift meant to symbolize trust. And she understood something with absolute clarity, something that settled into her chest like a steady, unshakable truth. This wedding was no longer a celebration. It was a stage, and whatever happened next would not be decided by the man waiting outside, but by the woman who had just learned she had been watched all along. Ava did not scream, and she did not drop the box, because panic would have given the moment away, and right now silence was the only thing she still owned. So she closed the lid gently as if nothing inside had changed, and set it back on the marble counter with the same care she had used when she believed it was a symbol of love. Then she reached for her phone again, not to call for help, but to open the front camera and hold it up at an angle, watching how the light caught the hidden lens, confirming what her instincts already knew, that it was active, that it was not decorative, that somewhere beyond these walls there was a receiver, a screen, a person who had expected to see her smile when she opened it. And the thought did not break her, it sharpened her. Outside the suite the music swelled slightly, as someone tested the speakers for tomorrow. Laughter spilled down the hallway, glasses clinked. A world still perfectly aligned with the version of her life everyone believed in. And Ava stood in the center of it all, feeling the quiet shift beneath her feet, like the ground had not cracked, but had simply revealed a different layer, colder and more deliberate, and she began to trace it backward, every small detail now rearranging itself with unsettling precision, the way Graham always seemed to know when she had been restless, the way he had once repeated a sentence she had only whispered to herself while standing alone on the balcony, the way his reassurances always came too quickly, too accurately, as if he had not guessed her fears but had watched them unfold in real time. She turned toward the mirror again, studying her reflection not for reassurance but for control, smoothing her expression until it matched the version of Ava Brooks that the world recognized, composed, thoughtful, unshakably calm, because whatever this was, it had been built over time, which meant it could not be dismantled with a single emotional reaction. It required intention, and intention required clarity. Her thumb hovered over her contacts before she finally selected a name she had not called in months, Daniel Reed. And as the line rang, Ava picked up the box once more, holding it differently now, not as something given to her, but as evidence, as a question that demanded an answer. And when Daniel's voice came through, steady and alert, she did not explain everything. She did not need to. She only said that she had found something inside a gift, and that she needed him to come to the estate without being seen. And there was a pause on the other end, just long enough to tell her he understood more than she had said. Before he agreed without hesitation, Ava ended the call and exhaled slowly, placing the box back down, her fingers no longer trembling, her heartbeat no longer racing, because the fear had already done its work and what remained was something quieter, something stronger, a decision forming in real time. Not about whether she would go through with the wedding, but about how the truth would be revealed. And as she reached for the door handle, the noise of celebration rushed back in, bright and careless and unaware, and Ava stepped out to meet it with the same calm smile, carrying inside her the certainty that by this time tomorrow, every light in this place would be forced to illuminate something no one had been meant to see. Daniel Reed did not enter through the front gates, and he did not sign his name on any guest list, because men like him understood that visibility was a choice and tonight it was a liability. So by the time Ava felt the soft vibration of her phone against her palm, he was already inside the service corridor that ran behind the ballroom, moving past stainless steel doors and muted conversations of staff who had no idea a different kind of event had already begun. Ava excused herself from a circle of smiling guests with effortless grace, her voice light, her expression composed, every step measured as she crossed from the golden glow of celebration into the cooler, quieter hallway where the music faded into a distant echo. And when she saw Daniel waiting near the catering entrance, dressed in a simple dark jacket that made him invisible against the shadows, she did not waste time with explanations. She simply handed him the box. Daniel did not react immediately, which was how Ava knew this was worse than she had hoped, because he only grew still when something confirmed a pattern he already suspected. And as he opened the lid and angled it toward the dim overhead light, his jaw tightened just slightly before he spoke in a low, controlled voice, saying that this was not a novelty device and not something bought casually, that the lens was high-grade, discreet, designed to transmit rather than store, which meant someone on the other end could be watching in real time or accessing the feed remotely. Ava listened without interrupting, her arms folded loosely, her breathing steady, as if the words were landing somewhere outside of her rather than inside. And Daniel continued, explaining that the placement inside a personal gift was intentional because it guaranteed proximity, guaranteed trust, guaranteed that the device would be brought into private spaces without question. And then he paused, looking up at her with something that was not shock but recognition, asking carefully if there had been other moments when things felt too precise, too anticipated, and Ava did not answer right away because the answer was no longer a list of incidents but a full picture, a pattern so complete it felt engineered. The air between them shifted as realization settled into something heavier than fear, something structured, and Daniel closed the box gently before adding that if this device was active, it was unlikely to be the only one, that systems like this were rarely isolated, that whoever set it up believed in layers, in redundancy, in control that could not be easily broken. For a brief second, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the ballroom seemed almost unreal, like they belonged to a different life playing just a few feet away, and Ava glanced toward the corridor leading back to the light, picturing Graham exactly as he would be right now, confident, composed, surrounded by admiration, completely certain that tomorrow would unfold according to his design. She turned back to Daniel and asked one question, not whether they could stop it, but whether they could prove it, and Daniel held her gaze before giving a slow, deliberate nod, explaining that with enough time, he could trace signals, identify connections, possibly access the network behind it. But it would require careful timing and discretion, because if the system detected interference, it might shut down or wipe traces. Ava absorbed this without hesitation, because the decision had already formed inside her long before the details were complete, and she reached out, taking the box back into her hands, feeling its weight again, no longer as a symbol of affection, but as the first piece of evidence in something far larger. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried a certainty that did not ask for agreement, saying that the wedding would continue exactly as planned, that nothing would change on the surface, that every guest would arrive. Every camera would be ready, every light would be on, because if the truth was going to surface, it would not do so in a hidden hallway or behind closed doors. It would step into the same spotlight that had been built to celebrate a lie. And as Daniel watched her, he understood that whatever happened next was no longer about uncovering a secret. It was about choosing the moment the entire world would see it. The night did not slow down for Ava Brooks, and that was exactly what she needed. Because the louder the laughter became and the brighter the chandeliers glowed, the easier it was to hide the quiet precision of what she was about to set in motion. So she stepped back into the ballroom with the same measured grace, her shoulders relaxed, her smile soft, greeting guests who reached for her hands and told her how radiant she looked, how perfect everything felt, how lucky she was. And she accepted every word with a calm nod, as if she were still standing inside the version of the evening they all believed in. Across the room, Graham Sinclair turned toward her, his expression warm, confident, the kind of composure that came from a life where control had never been questioned. And when he walked over, placing a gentle hand at the small of her back, Ava did not pull away, she did not flinch, because she understood. Now that his touch had always been part of the same system, reassuring on the surface, calculated beneath it, and when he asked if she liked the gift, his voice low and certain, Ava met his eyes and answered with a quiet smile that she did, watching closely for any shift, any flicker that might reveal what he believed he had just witnessed through that hidden lens. Graham only nodded, satisfied, as if everything was proceeding exactly as expected, and that confirmation settled something final. Inside Ava, not anger, not fear, but clarity. Later, when the music softened and the guests began to drift toward the outdoor terrace overlooking rows of vineyards stretching into the dark California hills, Ava excused herself again, this time without urgency, moving through the side corridor where Daniel was already waiting with a small tablet and a focused stillness that matched her own. And without a word, he showed her what he had begun to trace, faint signal patterns, encrypted connections, branching outward like veins beneath the surface, indicating that the device in her hand was only one point in a much larger network, one that had been active long enough to build history, to collect data, to observe without interruption. Ava studied the screen, not trying to understand every technical detail, but recognizing the shape of it, the intention behind it, and she asked if there was a way to bring it into the open without shutting it down, without alerting whoever controlled it. And Daniel hesitated for only a second before saying it would be risky but possible, that if they mirrored the signal at the right moment, they could display what the device saw, not just to them, but to any screen connected to the venue system. The idea did not shock her. It aligned with what she had already decided, and she nodded slowly, telling him that tomorrow every screen would be on, every guest would be watching, every camera would be ready to capture what was meant to be a perfect ceremony. And that was exactly when the truth would step forward, as the distant sound of a toast rose from the terrace, glasses lifted under the open sky. Ava closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the weight of the night settle into something steady and unshakable. Then she opened them again and turned back toward the light, toward the man who believed he had already seen everything there was to see, unaware that the same gaze he had hidden in the dark was about to be pulled into the center of the brightest room he had ever stood in. Morning arrived without hesitation, pouring pale gold light over the vineyard as if nothing beneath it had shifted, and Ava Brooks stood in front of the full-length mirror while the stylist adjusted the final layers of her gown, each movement careful, practiced, unaware that the woman they were preparing was no longer walking toward a promise but toward a revelation. The room smelled faintly of fresh roses and pressed linen. Soft music drifting from a speaker in the corner, everything calibrated to create calm, and Ava allowed it to settle around her like a surface she could step across without falling through, her expression serene, her breathing slow, because every detail mattered now. Every second had a purpose, and when the stylist stepped back and said she looked perfect, Ava met her own reflection and understood that perfection, in this moment, was not about beauty but about control. Her phone vibrated once on the table, a message from Daniel, brief and precise, confirming that the signal was still active, that the connection had not been interrupted overnight, that the system behind it was stable and waiting, just like the man downstairs greeting guests with effortless confidence. And Ava picked up the phone, reading the words only once before setting it down again, because there was nothing left to question. Outside the suite, footsteps moved quickly, coordinators speaking in low, urgent tones, adjusting timelines, aligning cues, building toward the ceremony that was now less than an hour away. And when Ava stepped into the hallway, the world greeted her exactly as it should have. Admiration in every glance, warmth in every voice. No sign that anything was about to fracture. Graham stood near the grand staircase, speaking with a group of guests, his posture relaxed, his smile controlled but genuine enough to convince anyone watching that he was a man stepping into a future he had chosen. And when he saw Ava, his expression softened just slightly, as if she were the final piece of something he had already secured. And he crossed the distance between them with quiet confidence, taking her hand in his and telling her she looked incredible, that everything was ready, that today was going to be exactly what they had planned. Ava held his gaze, steady and unflinching, and for a brief moment there was a silence between them that only she understood, because she was no longer standing inside his version of the day, she was standing just outside of it, watching it unfold from a place he could not reach. She nodded once, softly, letting her fingers rest in his as if nothing had changed, and he smiled. Again, satisfied, turning slightly to acknowledge another guest, already shifting his attention with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was guaranteed. The ceremony space had been transformed overnight into something almost unreal. Rows of white chairs facing a floral arch that framed the distant hills, cameras positioned discreetly along the edges, screens mounted for those seated farther back. Every angle designed to capture the moment two lives would officially become one. And as Ava took her place just out of sight, waiting for the music to begin, she felt the quiet hum of anticipation ripple through the crowd, a shared breath before something meaningful, something permanent, and she closed her eyes for just a second, not to steady herself, but to mark the exact point where everything would change. Somewhere behind the walls, Daniel was watching the signal, preparing the connection, aligning timing with precision. And somewhere within the system, unseen and uninterrupted, the hidden lens remained active, still believing it was observing a private moment, still unaware that it was about to become the center of a truth too large to contain. And when Ava opened her eyes again, the music began to rise, the first notes of a ceremony built on trust, echoing outward as she took her first step forward, not into a future she had been promised, but into a moment she had chosen. The music swelled as Ava Brooks stepped onto the aisle, each note rising into the open air like a promise the world was ready to believe, and every guest turned toward her at once, their faces soft with admiration, their phones already lifted to capture what they thought would be a flawless beginning. While at the end of the aisle Graham Sinclair stood waiting, composed and certain, his posture steady, his expression calm in the way of a man who believed nothing here could surprise him. Ava walked slowly, her steps measured against the rhythm, the delicate fabric of her gown brushing against the white petals beneath her feet, and with every step she felt the weight of the moment not as pressure but as precision, because everything had aligned exactly where it needed to be, every eye forward, every screen active, every second accounted for. When she reached him, Graham took her hands without hesitation, his touch warm, reassuring, familiar in a way that would have once steadied her. And the officiant began to speak, voice clear and practiced, guiding the room into silence as the ceremony unfolded. Words about trust and partnership drifting into the bright morning air, and Ava listened without reacting, her gaze steady on Graham's face, studying the ease in his expression, the quiet confidence that came from believing he had already seen every version of her that mattered. The officiant paused, preparing to transition into vows, and that was when Ava gently released Graham's hands, a small movement that drew just enough attention to shift the air, subtle at first, like a change in temperature no one could yet name. And she reached for the microphone resting near the podium, her fingers steady as she lifted it, and for a brief second the world seemed to hold its breath, uncertain but still trusting the script it had been given. Ava's voice was calm when she spoke, not raised, not trembling, but clear enough to carry across every row, every camera, every quiet expectation, as she said, "Before we continue, I need everyone to see something." And a ripple moved through the crowd, confusion replacing certainty, while Graham's expression shifted just slightly, not fear, not yet, but a flicker of something unsettled. Ava turned toward the nearest coordinator and asked for the screens to be activated, her tone polite, almost gentle, as if she were making a simple request, and after a brief hesitation, the large displays positioned along the ceremony space flickered to life, their bright surfaces cutting through the sunlight, drawing every eye upward. For a moment nothing appeared, just a blank glow reflecting the sky, and then the image sharpened, resolving into a close view of the velvet-lined box, the one Ava had opened the night before, now displayed larger than life, its details impossible to ignore, and a murmur spread through the guests as curiosity turned into confusion. Ava stepped slightly to the side, giving the screens full attention, and with a quiet motion, she opened the box again in her hands, mirroring the image above, aligning reality with what everyone could now see. And then she tilted it just enough for the hidden lens to catch the light, a small glint that transformed the object from a gift into something else entirely, something undeniable. Silence fell, not gradual but immediate, as recognition moved through the room, and Ava spoke again, her voice steady, unwavering, saying, "This was given to me as a symbol of trust." And she let the words settle before continuing, "But it was designed to watch me instead." And in that moment the ceremony was no longer a ceremony. The script had broken, the illusion had lifted, and every person present understood that they were no longer witnessing a wedding, but the beginning of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The silence did not fade. It deepened, stretching across the rows of white chairs as if the entire vineyard had stopped breathing, and Ava Brooks stood at the center of it, still holding the open box, the small hidden lens catching sunlight like something exposed for the first time, while the screens continued to display it in impossible clarity, leaving no space for doubt or dismissal. A low murmur began to ripple through the guests, uncertain at first, then sharper, questions forming in, whispers that moved from one row to the next, and at the edge of that growing tension, Graham Sinclair finally stepped forward, his composure still intact but tightened, like a surface beginning to strain under pressure, and he let out a quiet breath before speaking, his voice controlled, measured, reaching for calm as he said there must be a misunderstanding, that the device was likely part of the craftsmanship, something technical, something harmless, and a few guests shifted in their seats, wanting to believe him, wanting the narrative to return to something safe. Ava did not interrupt him, she did not raise her voice, because she understood that truth did not need volume when it had evidence, and as Graham spoke, she simply reached into the box and angled it again toward the light, allowing the reflection to sharpen, allowing the lens to become undeniable, and when she looked back at him, her expression remained steady, not accusing, not emotional, but clear in a way that left no space for negotiation. From the side of the ceremony space, Daniel Reed stepped forward, his presence quiet but precise, carrying a small device in his hand, and without asking for attention, he connected it to the system already running the displays, and within seconds the image on the screen shifted, no longer a still close-up but a live feed, moving, adjusting, revealing the exact perspective of the hidden camera itself, showing angles that could only exist if the device had been active, observing, transmitting. The reaction was immediate, a collective intake of breath as realization moved through the crowd, and the murmurs turned into something louder, something heavier, as phones lifted higher, recording not a wedding but a revelation. Graham's expression changed then, not dramatically, not enough for panic, but enough for truth to begin breaking through the edges, his jaw tightening, his gaze flickering briefly toward the screens before returning to Ava. And for the first time, there was no certainty in his posture, only calculation. Ava spoke again, her voice still calm, but now carrying a weight that reached every corner of the space, as she said that this was not an accident, that it was not decoration, that it was part of something designed, something built to observe her without consent. And she paused just long enough for the words to settle before adding that this was only the beginning. Daniel did not speak, but the screens behind them shifted once more, data patterns appearing briefly, enough to suggest depth without overwhelming, enough to confirm that what had been found was not isolated. And as the image flickered back to the lens, the message was clear without needing explanation. In the front row, Eleanor Sinclair sat motionless, her expression no longer composed but stunned, as if something she had trusted without question had just been turned inside out. And around her the room continued to shift, certainty dissolving into disbelief, admiration into unease. And at the center of it all, Ava remained exactly where she stood, not stepping back, not stepping forward, but holding her ground in a moment that no longer belonged to expectation or illusion, only to the truth that had finally been brought into the light. The air no longer belonged to celebration, and it did not return to silence. Instead, it fractured into something restless, shifting between disbelief and realization as Ava Brooks stood unmoving, the open box still in her hands while the truth continued to unfold behind her on every glowing screen. And for a brief moment it seemed as though the entire space was waiting for Graham Sinclair to restore control, to say something that could pull everything back into place. He stepped forward slowly, his voice lower now, more deliberate, as he tried again to frame the situation, saying that security had always been important, that he had only wanted to protect what mattered, that in a world where privacy was constantly at risk, he had taken measures to ensure safety. And a few heads turned, searching for reassurance in his words, searching for something that could make sense of what they were seeing. Ava listened without interruption, her gaze steady, because she understood that explanation. Without truth was only another form of control, and when he finished, she did not argue, she did not accuse, she simply nodded once, as if acknowledging the version of reality he was offering, before turning slightly toward Daniel. Without a word, the screens changed again, and this time the image was not just the lens or the live feed. It was something deeper, structured, undeniable, fragments of data arranged with precision, timestamps, access logs, recorded moments labeled and stored, each one aligning with days and times Ava recognized, private conversations, quiet evenings, moments she had believed belonged only to her, now revealed as entries in a system that had been watching, organizing, preserving. The effect was immediate and irreversible, the room shifting from confusion into clarity, because this was no longer a question of intent, it was evidence of pattern. And the difference between the two settled heavily across every face in the crowd. Graham's composure did not shatter, but it changed, the certainty replaced by something more guarded, more calculating, as he glanced briefly toward the screens, then back at Ava, as if searching for a way to contain what could no longer be contained. In the front row, Eleanor Sinclair lowered her gaze, her posture collapsing inward just slightly, the kind of quiet recognition that did not need words to be understood, and around her the whispers grew louder, no longer uncertain but defined, no longer searching for explanation but absorbing what had already been proven. Ava took a single step forward then, not toward Graham, but toward the center of the space that had been prepared for vows, her voice calm as she spoke again, saying that trust was not something that could exist under surveillance, that love did not require observation to feel secure, and that what had been built here was not a partnership but a system. And she let the word rest in the air long enough for its meaning to settle into every corner of the room. Daniel stepped back slightly, his role complete, the screen still active, the evidence still visible, and for the first time since the ceremony had begun, nothing else needed to be shown, because the truth had already taken its place in the light, undeniable and complete. And as Ava stood there, framed by the same arch that had been meant to mark a beginning, it became clear to everyone watching that what they were witnessing was not the continuation of a wedding, but the final, unraveling of something that had never truly been what it claimed to be. No one moved to stop her, because there was nothing left to stop. The moment had already crossed a line that could not be reversed, and Ava Brooks stood beneath the floral arch for one last second. The same place where she had been expected to promise a future, now holding only the quiet certainty that she had reclaimed her present. She looked at Graham Sinclair not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that stripped away every illusion that had once surrounded him. And in that gaze there was no longer any need for explanation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been seen, already been heard, already been proven. Slowly, Ava reached for her left hand, her fingers steady as she slid the engagement ring free, the diamond catching the sunlight in a final, fleeting reflection of what it had once symbolized. And without hesitation, she stepped forward just enough to place it gently inside the open box, setting it directly over the hidden lens, covering it completely, a quiet, deliberate gesture that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. The screens behind her still glowed, the evidence still visible. But in that single motion, she shifted the focus away from what had been done to her and toward what she was choosing now. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, even, but it carried through the space with unmistakable finality as she said that love did not require permission to breathe, that it did not need to be monitored to be real, and that anything built on control could not become a life she would step into. The words did not echo, they settled, grounding themselves in the silence that followed. And Ava did not wait for a response, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to repair. She turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet dignity that drew every eye as she stepped away from the altar, her gown moving softly behind her, each step carrying her further from the version of herself that had once believed this day would mark a beginning. The guests parted instinctively, creating a path without being asked. Their expressions changed, no longer filled with celebration, but with something deeper, a recognition of what they had just witnessed, not a scandal, not a spectacle, but a moment where truth had been chosen over comfort. Somewhere behind her, voices began to rise again, questions forming, conversations breaking open, but they no longer belonged to her, and she did not turn back to listen. As Ava moved beyond the rows of chairs and into the open space beyond the ceremony, the sunlight felt different, no longer filtered through expectation but clear, direct, unclaimed, and for the first time since the night before, her breath came without weight, steady and unguarded. Daniel watched from a distance, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The plan had unfolded exactly as intended, but what remained now was not about evidence or exposure. It was about the choice she had made in front of all of them, a choice that could not be undone. Ava paused only once, just beyond the edge of the gathering, not to look back, but to let the moment settle fully into her, the end of something that had once defined her path, and the beginning of something that no longer needed anyone else's permission. And then she continued forward, leaving behind the music that had stopped, the screens that still glowed, and the man who had believed he could see everything, except the moment she decided to walk away.